Hi, so this video, it was inspired by Marcus Nashington. He made a video about book covers and how they affect your decision making on whether or not you read a book. And I think that's pretty interesting because it's related to one of my classes. I'm taking a paratext class right now, which I think explicitly is not related to like front cover and stuff, pictures, because it's paratext, but it's kind of just like a shorthand for the surrounding material, commentary, and all that type of stuff. So it's because of that, because I have been taking a class on it, thinking about it. I've read some books that highlight it, and also I think about it a lot on my own. I think I could maybe say one or two interesting things in a 20-minute video. That's being optimistic, I realize that. But yeah, so I just gathered some books here. I don't know if I'll go through all of them because I kind of picked mostly books that if I saw them like by themselves, as far as I can imagine, I would probably read them if I didn't know much about them. And I'll go into exactly why in each case. But that's not necessarily where I'm coming from always. It's not always going to be, oh, I assume I know nothing about it. Let's see what I can do, whatever. So, yeah, I guess I'll start with this one here. This one's a classic, like, book cover. So Library of America does these editions, and it's just a nice hardcover of classic American authors. This one's Melville, obviously, 3 of his famous books, and it's just a simple hardcover. And if I was to walk up to this, you'd obviously know Melville. You think, okay, this is a pretty nice edition. It's not too expensive. Well, if you buy it new, they are very expensive, but I would walk up to it. It's nice and simple, has the author's photo, which I really like. It's pretty minimalistic, I would say, red, white, and blue with a black cover, white words. It's just nice. It's just nice. It does what it has to, and that's it. And that's nice. So I would buy that one if I was just walking up to it. And I also think it's pretty simplistic on the back too, and I think that's also a good thing. But being simple is not always ideal. So this is, in some sense, the exact opposite. Now the front, you could say, is fairly simple. It's just it's a picture, and then it has Sarah Bernhardt up here, and then it has the title, The Arcades Project, the author, Walter Benjamin. Then down here it has the translated by 2 people. That's also a fairly large book, if you can see. And then you look at the spine, pretty nice, somewhat minimalistic. And then the back has tons and tons of quotes. And I wonder why they did this. So they have a small summary at the top, when it was written, all this stuff. Then J.M. Coetzee, Peter Ackroyd, and then several people I've never heard of. And then it has a little small thing about the translators. And then another thing it has on it, though, is the Belknap Harvard, which, in my opinion, is one of the best university presses, just by what they put out. Nothing to do with really Harvard. I think they just have so much extra money that they can basically do whatever they want. But I've recently been looking at, like, so they have the Dumbarton Oaks. I think it's like a medieval Latin library. I don't know. No, it's not specifically Latin, but it's medieval library. And I've been looking at the Carmina Burana, which is pretty interesting if you haven't looked into that. But They also have the Murtry, or Murti, yeah, Murti. Um, I think it's like Indian Classics Library. I don't know the specific designations, but yeah, this has always been one of my favorite covers because if you see it up close, it has a red line going down the center, and it's a very nice picture of an arcade in the past. Yeah, I just think it's very nice, and also the pages are nice quality. Yeah. So just speaking, just walking up to it, this book is interesting. It would look like it was very intricate and has a lot to it, so that would make it more worth getting, rather than something you could just read and throw away. And then another one with a similar reasoning behind it, but one I don't like as much as probably any of the others I'll show. Yeah, one I don't like as much as any of the others I'll show is this book here, and I think that New Directions has especially good book design. I think generally they tend to be minimalistic, or focus on color and like style rather than blasting you in the face with stuff. But yeah, this is obviously a very minimalist type thing. Cantos of Ezra Pound, which is probably the exact opposite of what you find in here. Simple black and white. Well, yeah, but yeah, don't like it very much, unfortunately. And yeah, one thing I'll get to with this next book is when I go into a bookstore, I very rarely look at the front of a book to know whether to pick it up or whether to see if it's interesting. I'm almost always looking at this, the sliver, and that's all that can convince me that a book is very interesting. And this one here is Robert Musil's Diaries, but I remember seeing this one in a bookstore in Berkeley, California, after I had bought it. But I happened to see it, and it's very striking, like the patterns, and then the like sort of a classical Hellenistic type face it looks like, and then here's the front. And so what would kind of get me interested in this is that it's selected, translated with a preface by one guy, and then edited with an introduction by another guy, and then those two people worked on it for for the author of the diaries, Robert Musil. So when I look at academic works, I think I tend to side with a collaboration because I think it will be more intricate and more extensive. If two people are willing to work on it, it probably has a higher chance of being difficult, which is always nice. Of course, that's not always the case. Sometimes only one person can convince themselves to do it, and then it's as good as two people. But that's just something I happen to notice with that. Walter Benjamin, this one, a couple others I've noticed, translations especially. But yeah, that's something. And then the back here, a lot of quotes, a lot of stuff going on. But I think with a book like this, especially that it's so large, you can fit a little extra. And I think, especially looking at the market, I can't imagine someone who likes YA books walking up and thinking, "Oh, this Diaries of Robert Musil." So you're not really shooting for that group, most likely. I always see weird things. Like sometimes I watch just random book stuff, and I see like people pick up some completely bizarre things that I can't imagine they would be interested in or like. And I don't look into it too much. I don't follow see if they actually like it or something. But I'm surprised a lot. I guess I stereotype to an extent, but also I don't think the stereotypes are very far off. But the next one here is a kind of a similar thing. It's more of a scholarly, not the typical reader would read. Only someone who's very interested in this type of stuff. It's Cesare Pavese, his diaries. And So let's say, for example, I was only looking at this. And let's say I just happened to know Pavese by reading one of his poems. Maybe a friend showed me the poem. And I would say, huh, so I know his name, and he's from an interesting time period. This business of living, that really gives you a perfect representation of the feeling of this book. You know, he killed himself, I think it tells you on the back. And I suppose if you're drawn to like somber or depressing journals, diaries, then that will be very eye-catching. And if you're not, it's nice that they tell you, because I think in Michael Silverblatt and William Gass, they were talking about The Tunnel in 1995 when it came out, and Michael Silverblatt said like the first 100 pages or something are very difficult, and William Gass said, yeah, that's like an old modernist technique that you only allow the ones that deserve to be there in. And he was joking to an extent, because he then said subsequently, immediately after, that it would be disingenuous to put the most difficult part halfway through. Like, just have it be, oh, you know, this is an easy book, ramp up the difficulty, and then they weren't expecting it, and then that annihilates all the readers. Like, all the readers just jump off the train halfway through. He said it, you know, and he's right, that I think as a writer, you shouldn't be deceptive. You shouldn't be needlessly deceptive. And I think if you consciously went, I'm putting the most difficult part in the beginning, maybe I should move it to the middle so people don't realize it's this difficult yet. And then they get invested, and then the sunk cost fallacy kicks in or something like that. I think that would be deceptive in a negative sense. And I got in a... If you look at that video, you may see me in the comments arguing with some guy who was like, oh yeah, these pretentious people, they make their novels difficult. You know, but whatever. Some people like easy books and some people don't. That's all I have to say about it. And no one's holding you at gunpoint to read The Tunnel by William H. Gass. So, all right, so that's this business of living. And then next I have probably one of my favorite book designs I've seen. And I've showed this on here before, but this is Rilke, his new poems by Copper Canyon Press. Isn't that just a nice, like, if I saw that, I was just, dang. That's not why I bought it. I bought it because I heard this translator, Joseph Cadora, he did a new translation pretty recently, I think the last 10 years or so, and yeah, from what I remember, they were saying it was very interesting. They posted some examples, and I really enjoyed it. And then I also saw that Robert Haas like recommended it, and I know he's a fairly well-known poet. I think he does translations, that sort of thing. So yeah, all that kind of pointed me in the right direction. Copper Canyon Press, they do some of my favorite like Chinese translations and stuff. So yeah, that all that kind of put me onto it. And that's not even speaking about the front cover or this. Like, if I walked across this, it would be I'd be very intrigued by the picture. Of course, Rilke is one of my favorite authors, but even if he wasn't, I think I'd be like, huh, you know, it's interesting. New poems, you know, it's kind of ambiguous, just black and gold, and then this like stylistic picture. I think I would be interested in it, even if I didn't know much about Rilke. And then I'll get to one of my favorites here. Maybe you saw it peeking over. This isn't really a cover or anything like that, but man, if you just walk across that and you have the money, how can you not get it? That's just perfect. And then, let alone if you know anything about Robert Musil or Austria in the 1920s and stuff, like, that's just... And then the whole thing. I bought this as a birthday present because I've been wanting it for like 2 years, so I'll let it slide. I'll let it slide this time. But yeah, so that's published by Knopf, and um, I have no association with Knopf. If I see it, I'm like, whatever, is the book interesting compared to a university press or New Directions, Dalkey Archive, Copper Canyon Press, what is it, Contramundum Press. If I see those, I will look at the book, even if I'm completely thrown off by the title. If I think the title's stupid or anything, I'll still look at it. I'll give it a chance. But with Knopf, if I looked at it, I'd be like, it's probably going to be some typical like president biography, or I don't even really have a good association with it because I guess I just don't encounter those books very often. But yeah, they did this Robert Musil one, so it's pretty good. And here's the paperback of it that was published at the, I think the same time by Vintage, so I guess they're related, but it's a nice thing too. And I do have to say, when I first heard about this book, it was on a website, a literature forum, and the title struck me as something interesting, and then when I learned about the time period, I was more interested by it. And then when I looked into it, I, like as you do, opened the front. This is actually on a PDF because I downloaded it, but I read the chapter titles and they were very funny. And then you open it, part 1, a sort of introduction, and then the chapter 1, from which, remarkably enough, nothing develops. And if you haven't read the first paragraph of this book, I would really recommend it because it's very funny. But yeah, when I looked more into it, I was like, this 2,000-page book that people always freak out, it's difficult and all this stuff. It starts out funny, so, and I've read a decent amount of this book several times, and it stays funny. So I think really, and I've noticed this with how David Foster Wallace talks about Infinite Jest, how he tried to make it a sad book, and people's comments kept being about how funny it was and stuff. And I can't imagine Robert Musil tried to make this a depressing or like bureaucratic or boring book. I think he tried to make it, as funny as it is. Well, that's kind of obvious, but I think he tried to make it funny, and I think the people who think it's like drudgery or something are missing the point to an extent. I think they're looking for something that's not there and not meant to be there. Yeah. So that's that. Robert Musil. And then I think I'll get to one of my favorite books that I've read as a whole, outside and in, is this here. And I really like Dalkey Archive, how they do their covers and stuff. Well, some of them look ridiculous, and you can't even imagine. They must have been low on money when they designed it or something. And but yeah, these are very good. I really like the simplistic, William Gaddis, the recognitions, then the publisher, black and white. Because the thing I thought about, when I go in bookstores, I almost always look at just the spine, and that's how I think, okay, if the title's interesting, or if it's a publisher I like. Those are the two main things. And then, of course, if I know the author, if they were friends with someone I liked. But so, let's assume I don't know the author. I would go by the title and, the author's name to an extent, and what the spine looks like in the publisher, because those are almost always on the spine. And I think it can be dangerous if you get into this. You can fall into confirmation bias, but I've done this in the library several times. I've just gone through and just looked through everything, hundreds and hundreds of books, just spent several hours on it. And you can get very precise with titles, because there are just some titles that anyone with decent taste would not pick. And I think you can get some outliers there, but like Slow Lightning or Cold Fire or something like that. Those sort of like obvious opposites. I think those. Can I think of an example that's good? No, I can't. And I tried to think of one for a long time. Well, I did think of one, but I've forgotten it now. But there was one like decent book that was like that. But I think those sort of like I see poetry books with it like so much. Like these contemporary poetry books, they just always do that. That's the Slow Lightning is one of them, and it's horrible. And I'm just like, whoever would pick those must be ignorant of something. And if they're ignorant of that, they must be ignorant of related things, which, has not been good from what I've seen. But so yeah, stuff like that, like Slow Lightning, those obvious opposites that are just like, oh, I just pick something, and people be like, wow, that's very thoughtful. Lightning can't be slow, you know. It's just like low-hanging fruit, and it's ridiculous. But I think on the opposite end, something that's fairly easy that I really enjoy that has a pretty long tradition is exemplified by this book, The Recognitions. Books starting with the Trial, The Disconnected, The Odyssey. Maybe it wasn't called the Odyssey back then, but the something. It's a pretty old tradition, and I really enjoy it. But it's so old that even like horrible books do it. So you can't go by the something. You have to go by what word is next to the. And that's what I've started to do. I've started to look like, well, what word are they putting with it? Is it like an obvious word? What connotation does the word have? What feeling does the word give off? And this can get pretty like you have to have a precise intuition for this, and I'm not sure I do, but I have looked through a lot of them, and a lot of them are bad, unfortunately. But a lot of the best books are the something. So it's just unfortunate that it's such an old tradition that silly people do it. But yeah, the recognitions, continuing on with it. The cover, it's the author. This is William Gaddis when he was on his travels. It just has the title simply, and then an introduction. And then the back, pretty simple. I think this quote is stupid. Cynthia Ozick, the recognitions is famous for not being famous enough. And then Jonathan Franzen, the text of post-war fiction. I think Jonathan Franzen has horrific style, and that shows it. The text of post-war fiction. If William Gaddis heard that, he would be disgusted. I guarantee it. But the rest of it is good, apart from that quote. The recognition is a masterwork about art and forgery and the increasingly thin line between the counterfeit and the fake. Gaddis anticipates by almost half a century the crisis of reality that we currently face, where the real and the virtual are combining in alarming ways, and the sources of legitimacy and power are often obscure to us. I think that's a fairly accurate representation of it, but it's also a thick book. That's also something that affects people's decisions, but that's usually a good sign for me. But yeah, it's one of my favorite books. Next is a similar thing. His second book, William Gaddis Jr., similar thing. Pretty easy. This picture is from one of his letters. This picture on the front that has a whole bunch of numbers and stuff. Back is similar. Just a quote. So that's another related thing there. One of my favorite poetry books that I've had for a while. This is a Painting, this is an example of what a lot of publishers do. It's a painting of Odilon Redon. He's a Belgian painter from the mid to late 19th century, and he's very good. A little earlier than Rilke, but he overlaps because he lived a long life, and Rilke died kind of early. So that's Orpheus, if I remember correctly. Or an angel, I can't remember. Dang, I should know this. But anyway, yeah, this is one of my favorite books, so Rilke is pretty easy, pretty obvious. And I've noticed Vintage is one of the best, just really huge publishers. They do McCarthy, a lot of other good stuff. So if I was looking at this, I'd see Vintage. Oh, Vintage is pretty good usually. Rilke, you know, that sort of stuff. Translated German poetry, that's a good sign too. And then this one here, this one I bought without looking at the front, which is almost always what I do, but when I get it, it's interesting to see. This one's published by Columbia University Press. In my opinion, university presses are the easiest way to find the best books. Now, you do have good presses like Docky Archive and New Directions, but I'd say those are the outliers. But it's the opposite with university presses. The outliers are the bad ones. And with like commercial stuff, the outliers are the good ones. So this one's a little shiny. Difference in repetition. And, you know, their words repeat. It's a pretty interesting cover, I think. If I walked across this, I'd be interested. I actually did see this in a bookstore like maybe 2 years ago, and I didn't buy it because it was expensive. But then I saw something about Evandara and Deleuze, and then I looked more into it, and it seemed interesting, seemed good, so watched a couple lectures on it. It looked good, so that's how I ended up getting it. But the back is fairly simple too. This is what I like to see. If I see books like this, no matter what they are, fiction, poetry, nonfiction, whatever else, I would be interested in it. And then here is one of my favorite covers also, and it gets to something. So it's pretty like simplistic too, pretty bare. Author, title in Turkish, translated by, and then this picture, which is like a ship of fools type thing. It looks like it may actually be from like the Renaissance or Middle Ages time. And that's one thing I've noticed I have a weakness for, is like stylized drawings on the front. Like here's another example. This is just behind it. Li Po by New Directions. You know, the stylized calligraphy, ink drawing, or whatever it is. I have a weakness. Oh shoot! I have a weakness for those, and this is this similar thing. This is a press that only published this book. It was kind of an unusual book to come out. I'm really glad it did, but they didn't have many copies. And yeah, I think if I passed this in a bookstore, I would definitely pick this up. Just because it's the disconnected, you know, like I was saying, and Turkish author. I've never heard of that press. And then I would look at the cover. Wow, that's a really interesting picture. And then I would probably start reading it and really enjoy it. What else? What else do I have here? I guess. Okay. I'll just do this one and then another one, and then that'll be it, because I've been going on for a while. But this one is another example of what I really like. I really like pictures of authors on the front. I think they work really well most of the time. This is Cesar Vallejo. This gets to several things. University of California Press, picture of the author on the front, black and white, simplistic. You know, the side is another really amazing, really beautiful picture. All it is the title, you know. Front translated and edited by, a foreword by, I think he won the Nobel Prize. Introduction, then a chronology, 4 different dudes. You're like, oh, this guy's serious. So I knew about Vallejo before I looked at this, before I like saw this edition. like itself. So I didn't, but I imagined if I walked across this and I somehow heard his name before and I was like, what's he about? I'd probably be very interested in it. And then the back, fairly simple too, just some short 1 or 2 line quotes from magazines talking about him in general, or this book. Oh yeah, this picture is him in 1926. It's cool. Alright, and then the last one, which is like a very bad example. Well, not very bad, but if this wasn't like considered the greatest work in Chinese literature, I wouldn't have bought it, because it's kind of like stereotypical, see Chinese person, volume 1, the story of the stone. The story of the stone, you think of King Arthur, you're like, whatever, it's some weird Chinese adaptation of King Arthur. But then, I don't know if you guys can see this, but the cover detail, can you read that? Maybe not. But it says, detail from portrait of Thomas Paine, 1793, by Auguste Millier, reproduction by courtesy of National Portrait Gallery, London. Does this look like Thomas Paine? No. Just because of that, I would be like, okay, they obviously don't care at all about this author or the book. So they didn't even care enough to proofread the back. So, screw it. It's probably not a good book. They didn't even pay attention. But this is considered the best novel in Chinese literature, and this author is like the Shakespeare of Chinese literature. So it just shows how careless and ignorant whoever looked at this cover is, because they obviously didn't even pass over it once. But yeah, so that's like a horrible example to go with all the others. Yeah, I think another thing I wanted to get into just at the very end, I guess, is like genre distinctions, because I think in general they're relatively short-sighted, or too easy, because I've noticed with myself, I just have an intuition to go for the unusual things. So that means, to a large extent, I ignore genre. Speaking of whether it's poetry, whether it's philosophy, whether it's a classic, whether it's published 2 years ago. So those things don't matter too much to me, as in I've heard like people say, I don't really like poetry or something like that. To me that's always struck me as like pretty absurd, but they're basically saying they don't know much and they don't care to get into it. Okay, fair enough. But with genres like nonfiction or fiction, I think that's I've always felt that history is just a different type of story. It's not necessarily the truth, and if you really get into it, it's very hard to tell what the truth is in any situation. You can have probabilities of like reasonable truth, but there's no reason to full-on skepticism. I'm the only person that exists. That's just as ridiculous as thinking history is the truth. So I read this book, The Lifespan of a Fact, and it's kind of, I don't recommend it, but it had some good ideas in it. The main idea is to think about why people call something nonfiction, and that nonfiction as a genre has only been around for maybe 50 years, since like the 60s, roughly speaking, for like journalism and stuff. So it makes you wonder, why did they want to call journalism nonfiction? They were up to something. Because they used to write biographies and travel diaries and memoirs and histories, and they wouldn't have to call them nonfiction, because I think really that distinction is almost worthless, other than like a signifier of this is this category, as a bookseller or something like that. But even then, if the people who are visiting your bookstore are not discerning, and they're just ignorant and just walk around like, I don't know, milling cattle or something. Oh, I don't like nonfiction, something like that. Or I only like nonfiction because it's true, represents true reality. I've seen some people in like mostly related to STEM, like they're a science major, and it's mostly young people. So I know they're ignorant and they haven't realized it yet. But they say they don't like reading fiction because it's not real. It's like, what do you mean it's not real? Your story you tell yourself is fiction, like in the sense that, I mean, it could just be made up too, you know, but that's no reason to ignore every thought you have. But that's like easy. It's like, why do you even say that, you know? From their perspective, why would you even say that fiction's not real? What does that even have to do with anything, you know? They just haven't thought about it yet. But yeah, I've seen that quite a lot in college especially, but that's probably why, because everyone's young and hasn't thought about anything, which applies to me in things that I haven't realized yet, unfortunately. But okay, yeah, this video's gone on quite a long time. Yeah, so genres, I like philosophical novels and epic poems and fictional biographies. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. So yeah, I tried to make this half as long as it was, so hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought. Death is a gang boss.